Hey Strike listeners, today we're going to talk about the 40th year anniversary of the Hyatt Regency Skywalk Collapse. It was in August 17th, 1981 in Kansas City, where tragically 114 people lost their lives. As of today, this tragedy still remains the deadliest non-deliberate structural failure in the U.S. history. At that time, the Hyatt had just opened a year earlier, July 1st, 1980. And let me tell you, this hotel was the place to be on Friday nights in Kansas City at the time. They held Friday night dances, and the atrium was just beautiful. People would gather and marvel at the suspended sky walkways. It was the hotel's highlight, and they appeared to almost like float in the sky. Well, on this particular evening, around 1,600 people had gathered at the hotel's Friday night tea dance party in the atrium. Most of the guests were dancing and drinking and visiting with friends on the first floor of the lobby. But a few hundred spectators had gathered, scattered amongst the different floating skywalks that hovered above the lobby. As the music played and roared on, guests reported to hear a very loud crack at around 7 p.m. And then tragedy struck. The second and the fourth story walkways came crashing down as they separated from their suspended rods and fell on the dancers below. Hundreds of people were trapped underneath the concrete rubble, and many died on impact. As the disaster unfolded, scores of rescuers came to desperately help free people trapped underneath the steel and concrete structure. Concrete workers, construction workers, they all arrived with giant cranes, and they all pitched in together to help to lift the wreckage and access survivors that were trapped. Among the first emergency responders to the scene was a local ER doctor. His name was Dr. Joe Wackerly. And as he described, he said the decision was so difficult. He had to determine that night which of the victims that he could possibly help to survive and which would die no matter what effort he gave. He had to make that decision so he would know where to place his efforts, who was more likely to be helped from his work. At about 7:19 p.m., 7 ambulances had already arrived on the scene, and more would continue to flow in. Over 60 construction workers assisted with the rescue, and some people that were even in the dance contest, they still had numbers on the back of their shirts, walked around and helped to rescue people. They spent the entire night removing wreckage from the Hyatt. No matter how hard they worked, though, 114 people did die. Local responders came to aid the crew. Normal, everyday people like crane operator Chet Hinckley. He had brought his large crane from a nearby construction site and positioned it through the front lobby window, breaking the glass to get through so that he could lift the collapsed skywalks up and emergency crews could get underneath them to reach more trapped victims. A nearby liquor dealer, Frank Hashman, stood holding IVs next to the doctor as he worked on patients, and he amputated a man's leg right in front of Frank, hoping to help that man survive, but sadly, he did later die. Even Country Bill Ullman, who sacrificed his whole body to save victims, he came To the hotel, he brought his 95-pound jackhammer to help break up and remove concrete and steel decking to expose victims for rescuers to get to them. Sadly, 6 months later, Bill would commit suicide. He was just haunted by the images of that night and could never recover. A sprinkler had also ruptured on the hotel lobby floor that evening after the catastrophe, and so water was just spraying out of the sprinkler, filling the atrium, making it flood, and it was putting at risk some of the trapped survivors of drowning. The final rescue victim, Mark Williams, he had spent 9 hours, you guys, pinned underneath the lower skywalk with both legs dislocated, and he had almost nearly drowned in the water before they finally were able to shut off the water valve. Visibility had been very poor during the rescue time because of the dust, and power had been cut off in order to prevent fires. A total of 114 were killed, 216 had been injured, and 29 people had been pulled from the rubble to survival. These stories from survivors and workers at the Hyatt were all captured by local news crew that had actually been there to film the tea dance. Unbeknownst to them, their footage would be filming a catastrophe. Later, the Kansas City Star would actually earn a Pulitzer Prize for their amazing reporting on this story. Investigations would happen into the collapse to find out how could this possibly happen, and it had become the top engineering study. It taught students what catastrophe had happened, why it was caused, to really focus on construction and engineering when creating a building, accountability. They would later reveal that it was caused by a structural failure in the final design, and during construction, that design had been altered. Rather than having one very long rod connecting all the sky walkways, the walkways were built using 2 separate rods. The engineers truly thought that, this alteration was only going to change the appearance of the skywalks, but sadly it had changed the risk level too. The flaw in the design would, no matter what was planned, it was going to cause the weight of the walkway to eventually collapse on itself. It just happened to be this evening was the day of that collapse. The disaster has changed the way the industry professionals review design plans today all over the U.S. It provided a case study teaching first responders on an all-hazard approach. It went all across to universities and engineering ethic classes. And it taught everybody that the smallest personal responsibility can impact the biggest projects. Lots of time has passed since then. We are at the 40th year anniversary since this tragedy. The hotel has since changed ownership. It's now known as the Sheraton Kansas City Hotel at Crown Center. You can see the picture here. One of the skyway, the upper 4th level skyway, is no longer there, but you can see how it's blocked where the bridge once crossed. Those sadly who didn't survive the tragedy are now honored at a memorial. It's the Skywalk Memorial Plaza in Kansas City that's located very nearby. The sculpture is an abstract depiction of a couple dancing, and it features the names of those lost on the base. Lost, but never forgotten. Enjoyed this story? Give us a like, and be sure to subscribe to When Horror Strikes to hear the forgotten stories of the most notorious, horrifying, and sometimes puzzling tragedies. To remember is to learn from our past and to honor those before us.